From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. Just a moment from now, we're going to get to talk to the CEO and chairman of Johnson Johnson, Alex Gorsky, about that exciting new vaccine he has. But right now, we want to check on the markets first, and Abigail Doolittle is here with that.
David, it is a very risk-on day. In fact, right now we're looking at the S&P 500 near session highs, on pace for its best day since June of last year. So investors, traders all in after 2 down weeks, buying the dip. Lots of it having, of course, to do with vaccine optimism, creating a sense that the reopening, the economic reopening will occur perhaps more smoothly, more quickly. We have the reflation trade in play. So this means we have the major averages up, bonds down. That in itself is very risk-on. And because of the reopening play, travel stocks are doing even better. Your airlines, your cruise lines, hotels, the idea that if folks get vaccinated, that the dearth of traveling over the last year, that folks will really want to get out there. In fact, I just saw an article about around the world cruise lines that they're completely booked because people really want to get back out there traveling. And of course, again, one of the impetuses for today's big rally, Johnson Johnson, that great news around the 1-dose vaccine receiving the emergency authorization over the weekend. J&J is popping higher, and again, a big spark for today's risk-on day, the best day for the S&P 500 since June of last year, David.
Abigail, thank you so very much. That's Abigail Doolittle. Let's turn to that great news out of Johnson Johnson. It was nearly a year ago today when Alex Gorsky, the chairman and CEO of Johnson Johnson, told us that they had a promising vaccine candidate that they hoped to get into field testing in the fall, and if everything went well, they could have it available in the first quarter of 2021. And as of Sunday, it all came true, and we welcome Alex Gorsky now back to Bloomberg to take us through how they did it and where we go next. So first of all, I have to say congratulations for you, but for all of us, frankly, Alex. Well done. How did you do it? And looking back on it, what was the biggest hurdle you had to overcome?
Well, David, thank you very much for having me. And look, it's a very proud and humbling day here at Johnson & Johnson, but hopefully not only for the United States, but for the world. And look, David, I remember that day about 13 months ago. And whoever could have imagined then that the pandemic would reach the heights that it did, that all the economic challenges that you just mentioned that we would have been experienced. But, from day one, our scientists, our physicians, our engineers were as committed as ever to really making a difference for the world. And it started with great science, where we took a vaccine platform that we had used before in areas like Ebola and HIV. We applied new data from the spike protein. We very quickly put it into clinical trials. We gathered a lot of information. And really, it's all culminated in the news Friday from the FDA Advisory Committee, and then on Sunday from the CDC Advisory Committee, that we've got a safe, we've got an effective single-shot vaccine that can be refrigerated using very standard procedures. And that's going to be available right here in the United States to the tune of 100 million doses by June of this year.
So
I
Alex,
couldn't be more proud.
Sorry, take us through what we know about your vaccine at this point, because there's a lot of talk about efficacy in comparison to Pfizer and to Moderna. On the other hand, you were a little bit behind the others. Does that mean you've had more exposure to some of the variants that people are so concerned about?
The short answer is yes, David, it does. And look, from the very beginning, we tried to look at how could we design the very best possible vaccine in terms of safety, efficacy, dosing, and frankly, administration and logistics. And we had a platform that had been used in more than 100,000 patients that gave us a lot of confidence that the safety profile was very strong. We tested it thoroughly. And what's really important about our test, David, our clinical trials, was we didn't start until September. And so just as we had come out of what I would say the low point over the summer, and we started seeing cases increase certainly across the United States, but more importantly around the world, that's when our trial began. So we were really into the heat of the virus spread. Number two, 40% of our patients were in the United States, but we had about 40% in Latin America, and we had about 15% that were actually in South Africa. So where, one of the most difficult strains is the South African strain. And by the way, 90% of the 15,000 patients that we were working on there, or those that were infected, actually had the South African variant. And so it gave us a lot of data, and what we saw were still very strong effectiveness rates. In fact, 85% in serious cases, and 100% of the time this far has kept patients out of the hospital and kept them from dying. So we know that this is going to be a really important tool for healthcare providers around the world.
Go forward and give us a sense of where you're headed. Do you envision a world in which we have different versions of the vaccine for different variants, or do you think we know enough now to think we'll be able to have one version that will be good enough for all the variants?
Well, David, look, I think all of these vaccines work extremely well. And the fact that we've seen these kind of results from 3 different platforms now is very encouraging. And my recommendation is everybody needs to get a shot as soon as they possibly can, because every time this virus spreads, it's transmitted, and it has the potential to mutate, to cause another variant. And so the faster we can get people vaccinated to stop that from happening, the likely better outcome we're going to have. But the good news is also because of these new platforms that we have that are so much more adaptable, that right now companies, and ours included, is working on next generation should that be necessary. So we're going to have to see how this plays out over the next next 9 months. We could be in a situation where we see a precipitous decline in the virus. We could see some surges in the fall that we'll need to stay protective of. Or we could see where we could need a booster shot or another shot further down the road, similar to what you would do with the flu shot. But that being said, we're in a much better place today based upon all the great science, research, and engineering that we've been doing.
So give us a sense about getting into people's arms, because now you have the vaccine. We're all eager to get it and to protect us. You've got, as I understand, about 4 million doses ready to go. They came out of your Dutch facility. Are there manufacturing issues in Baltimore? Are you concerned at all about that?
No, look, we're on track with our plans. We do have approximately 4 million, 3.9 that are literally on trucks right now being rolled out in the United States. We expect to do 20 million in March. And look, over the next several weeks, we've got to go through regulatory approvals and a few other processes. But then we expect to hit a very strong cadence, as I mentioned earlier, so that we can be doing, we will have done 100 million doses by the end of June, and near 1 billion by the end of 2021, en route to a path of almost 2 billion by 2022. It's been a remarkable achievement here too. And while the discovery and the development of the vaccine, I think, has been really impressive, at the same time, we've had to scale up these manufacturing facilities. In this case, David, the site you were mentioning, it was a parking lot 8 or 9 months ago. Today, it's one of the most advanced biopharmaceutical manufacturing facilities in the world.
So is there anything more we can do to actually ramp up the production further than what you've already done? And that would either be Johnson & Johnson perhaps opening new facilities like Baltimore, or even partnering with others.
It's all about partnerships. And look, we're partnering and we're working hand in hand with the U.S. government. And I've got to say, they've been great collaborators, great partners, helping us unlock even additional sources where we could accelerate or increase some of our capacity. We're working with other pharmaceutical companies, internal and external suppliers. We've got a network of more than 10 different partners on a global basis that we put together to ensure not only that we can be very efficient and effective, but we also have got a robust network that is going to support this effort, not only for the next 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 weeks, but for the next several years, and we can get the kind of outcomes we want to achieve.
Give us a little bit of a sense about that distribution system and how it gets set up, how the priorities are set. You said you're working closely with governments. How much of it is with the White House, Jeff Zients and his team? How much of it is they're deciding where these 4 million and then ultimately 100 million go? How much of it is individual governors or states?
Sure. Well, look, it's been impressive to see the work of Jeff Zients and his team. And again, the outreach, the collaboration, the partnership in getting a lot of these programs into place during this particular period. We've got sites here in the United States, both that produce drug substance, as well as the finishing process where you actually fill the bottles. It's called fill and finish. And again, we have an extensive network here that's being expanded based upon the partnership that we're doing with the government. We've also got sites in Europe where we do the same thing, and outside of Europe as well. So that network has been put together, has been established, has undergone the technology transfer that's essential to getting this kind of complex manufacturing process in place. It's going through some of the final approval as we speak. But we've already demonstrated the ability to produce a significant and a very high throughput so that we can get the kind of volumes that we're talking about.
But Alex, when you have the 4 million or the 20 million or 100 million, who do you call to say, where should I ship them?
Well, right now it's directly to the government. So in the United States, the government determines, as you may have seen on some of the footage today, it goes from basically our distribution facility in UPS trucks to McKesson, and then the government works very closely to distribute it to the states. They're working closely with the governors as well as with some of the large retail chains. And, the good news is, David, I think now that we have a third vaccine out there, and by the way, kudos to Pfizer and Moderna for also significantly increasing their output. I would predict that in the second quarter, we're no longer going to be near as supply constrained. And as we get more doses out, we're going to be able to open up some of the requirements and restrictions regarding who can get the vaccine and who can't. And as a result, our throughput will go up. And I think we're going to see a big difference about the number of patients being vaccinated in the second quarter around our country, let alone the world.
Well, let's talk about the world for a minute, because as a practical matter, we're going to need the whole world vaccinated, I think, if we're really going to be safe from this thing. How concerned should we be about certain barriers? I mean, for example, are there any limitations on your ability to import from Europe to the United States, or vice versa, ultimately to export from the United States to Europe and elsewhere around the world?
Well, David, it's a good point because, look, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And we need to get vaccines out clearly and do shots in the arms here in America, but around the world, if we're ever going to achieve the kind of normalcy and, the kind of free travel that we enjoyed for decades before. And so we're collaborating and coordinating right now with European authorities, I mentioned earlier, with our sites in Europe. It's essential that we maximize our global supply chains, which we're doing, in fact, with the government and with other companies to achieve the kind of output that we're talking about. And we're working with organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well, for the developing parts of the world to make sure we can get them several 100 million doses as well. So it's comprehensive. And we're seeing the early waves of that in the United States. You're going to see that rapidly rolled out in Europe in our case, and simultaneously. And as we go through the course of the year, you're going to see that happening in many, many other parts of the world as well.
Finally, Alex, I know you well enough to know you think strategically, and it's become a commonplace for all of us to say the world's never going to be the same as it was pre-pandemic. But what about for Johnson & Johnson, for your industry? Can you see ways in which you're going to make different decisions about deployment of capital, employment going forward? Does it change the nature of Johnson & Johnson's business, what we've been through here with this pandemic?
Well, look, I'd say there's a few things that are very important strategic considerations for us going forward. And the first is the importance of global public health. I mean, one thing that this pandemic has demonstrated that if we don't have strong, resilient public health systems in place, we don't have national security, economic security, or frankly, security as a society. And so making that investment, focusing more on durability, sustainability, and maybe even some redundancy versus just maniacally on effectiveness and efficiency is going to be critical for us, whether it's storing PPE, creating vaccine capacity, or the way that we even think about handling surges in hospital is a very important lesson, I believe, for our industry. The second one for me, David, is just technology. And whether it's the technology of the science, the way we were able to collect data, quickly take the genomic information, apply it to a platform, have 3 vaccines in a period of months versus what ordinarily would require years. The way we've been able to share data and information to understand where this virus is and it isn't. I think it represents just a significant increase in the way we use data and the way that we apply that in decision-making in healthcare systems throughout the world. And last but not least, certainly the importance of health. There's not a CEO, there's not a government leader or a stakeholder now that's not thinking about what's my role in healthcare. How can I make sure that we're taking care of our populations, of our people, of our workforce? Because if we don't have health, it can put everything else at risk. So clearly a lot of risk, but I see a lot of opportunity coming out of this going forward, David.
Okay, finally, Alex, this is Bloomberg. You wouldn't think well of me if I didn't ask the question. Is Johnson & Johnson going to make money off of this vaccine? I know that's not why you did it. You did it because we needed you to do it. But are you going to make money?
Well, we're doing this on a not-for-profit basis. And, early on when we saw this, we knew that it was critical to not have cost, to not have the price of the vaccine get in the way of access and administration. And so we are committed to taking that approach during this pandemic phase. Longer term, look, we think that there will be a very significant opportunity with vaccines, not only in how it gets applied in other areas in infectious disease, but gosh, can it be applied in areas like cancer and Alzheimer's disease and other areas that could really offer some great new hope for patients and at the same time create a great business opportunity for Johnson & Johnson.
Well, Alex, once again, congratulations for you, but for all of us. I mean, it's a happy day for all of us when we have this vaccine. This is Johnson & Johnson Chairman and CEO. He is Alex Gorsky. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, David.
Coming up, the Biden administration approach to foreign relations and national security from Jane Harman of the Wilson Center. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Jane Harman, as of today, is Distinguished Fellow and President Emerita of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, having served in Congress, including as ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. She's also the author of the new book, Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to Confront Hard National Security Problems Makes Us Less Safe. So, Jane, thank you very much, and congratulations on your new position. Let's pick up with your book, actually, as I wonder, as we go into the Biden administration, and I want to talk specifically about national defense foreign policy on the one hand, intersecting with technology on the other, because there's a lot of reports the Biden administration is particularly focused on technology as a national security issue.
Okay, well, let's talk about it. It took me a while after leaving Congress in 2011 to figure out what I really wanted to say about the 3 decades since the Cold War ended. I have lived those decades, as I think you have, but I was in Congress for a long time and then heading the Wilson Center for a marvelous decade. And what I want to say about them is that we keep doing the same things and expecting a different result, hence the title of my book, Insanity Defense. And there are opportunities for the Biden administration to solve some of the very hard problems which need to be solved. Example, and I just wrote about this, we're now worried about domestic terrorism, which has been a problem over years. But do we need a new law? Do we need to repeat some of the mistakes of the Japanese internment camps or some of the things that Abraham Lincoln did or that Woodrow Wilson did? No, I don't think so. What we need is the best advice to Congress on crafting something very carefully. And I had proposed that when I was in Congress. It never got anywhere, but it was a multidisciplinary commission composed of people across the spectrum, just who you would think should be on such a thing, to advise Congress on that very delicate line between where radical views, which are protected under our Constitution, generate or actually perpetuate in the person who has the radical views conduct, which is in violation of our laws. And so we don't know how to do this well enough. We better learn it. That's kind of the point of the book.
So you're such a student of this issue. As you look at all the challenges and even threats to the United States today, do you put domestic terrorism at the top of that list, Jane?
I think I do. I think there are other threats. I think, frankly, you just had a wonderful segment on COVID and what J&J is doing, and Alex Gorsky sounds phenomenal. I think that's a gigantic threat. I mean, pandemics and more pandemics. And by the way, the best thing the U.S. could do to reconnect to our allies in the world is come up with a global solution for getting vaccines in arms around the world. We have a lot of folks in the private sector and elsewhere who could help with this. And we have our military, which is best in class in logistics. And we basically kept Ebola in Africa and helped eradicate it. So we can do this. And I would suggest that be, priority number one, which I actually think it is for the Biden administration.
So give some advice to the Biden administration for a moment here. What about China? Clearly, that's toward the top of the list in issues to deal with. What should a China policy look like, and how different would it be from a Trump administration China policy?
Well, Trump got some things right. At least he got the headlines right, or better said, in terms of him, the photo ops right. He had the right photo op with North Korea. He had a couple of good photo ops with China. Russia, not so much. Saudi Arabia, not so much. But in terms of China, should we be tougher on China? Oh, yeah. I mean, they have been stealing our technology. and their human rights policies are abhorrent. Abhorrent. Let's understand this. But what do? Instead of just making a big fuss, imposing sanctions, and pushing them into a confrontation, I think what we better do is shore up what we do better than they do. We have structural advantages in tech. You just raised tech. And Biden just came out with 4 executive orders last week in all the right places: critical minerals, semiconductors, pharma and PPE, and high capacity batteries. If we work with our allies to really accelerate the development of these things, we're building good high-tech jobs, which we need to have, and China won't be able to catch us. And on 5G, instead of what Trump did, which is just saying China 5G bad, and then not having an alternative, we have an alternative. We can work on, especially the software part of 5G, and leapfrog China.
What about Iran? A lot of talk about Iran, and getting back to the bargaining table. Of course, we had the military strike, the first military strike of the Biden administration against an Iranian militia base, essentially in eastern Syria. What's the right way forward with Iran?
Well, I thought that was actually right. That was a proportional response to Iran attacking us in Iraq, where Iran has quite a presence. But what was not good was the notice to Congress, which has been pointed out by members of Congress. If Biden were still chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he would be squealing about the tiny little briefing and the lack of consultation with the Gang of Eight, which I used to be part of as ranking member on House Intelligence. My book addresses this. Congress needs to pass a new authorization to use military force, setting out what the U.S. military posture should be around the world. But in addition to that, Congress needs to step up here. Congress is the incredible shrinking branch of government, and it's allowed for the expansion of the executive branch over many administrations, certainly George W. Bush, and certainly Obama, and definitely Trump, in ways that I think have reduced the oversight and the input of the people of the United States who elect members of Congress into our foreign and national security policies.
One of the things Congress can do is appropriate funds. Give us your sense about the military at this point. Should there be more money appropriated for the military? Certainly President Trump is proud of the fact that he got a lot of money for the military. Should there be more, and where should it go, if so?
Yeah, well, we should have a right-sized military. What does that mean? We need a military equipped to fight present and future wars, not to protect old legacy systems. I was guilty. I say this in the book. I represented the Aerospace Center of California, and I fought for all of those satellite contracts and foreign military sales that were relevant to my district. Well, some of that was good, but some of that was really not necessary. And what we need now, and I hope we will have this with a well-staffed foreign policy team and a well-staffed Pentagon, is a look at just what I said. What do we really need? And technology is a huge part of that. And protecting our space assets against vulnerability is another huge part of that. That's what we need. And then, oh, by the way, as most former secretaries of defense would tell you, certainly including Jim Mattis, whom I have a particular soft spot for, surging our soft power, making sure that before we go to war with anybody, the State Department and all the things that relate to persuading the world that the U.S. values and interests are worth supporting and worth emulating. That's what we need to be doing. And that has been absolutely shrunk under the Trump administration. And Joe Biden's making an investment there that I think is going to pay off in spades.
I was going to ask about that. You do have a sense that there's going to be a lot more money for state, because certainly President Trump cut it back.
There couldn't be less. And there also needs to be a restoration of morale there. I mean, let's understand, career Foreign Service people left in droves. A few were fired unfairly. And I think the place was decimated. And Tony Blinken and his team, very good, experienced people, will replenish the place. I was disappointed that Mike Pompeo, a guy I actually like and who had good experience and was a colleague in Congress, said he was going to restore the swagger to the State Department. I'm not sure about swagger, but he didn't restore the morale.
I think a lot of people were surprised and disappointed there. Thank you so much to Jane Harman. She's Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow and President Emerita as of today. Coming up, Richmond Fed President Tom Barkin will be joining us for an exclusive interview. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York, we are now going to turn to a Federal Reserve official. We're hearing from several of them this week, as it turns out, and now we are joined by Bloomberg. He is the international politics and policy and economics correspondent, and he has an exclusive interview with Tom Barkin of the Richmond Fed.
Thank you very much, and we would like to welcome the Richmond Fed President Thomas Barkin to Bloomberg Radio and Television Worldwide. Thank you very much for joining us today, Tom.
Glad to be here with you.
I want to start and get this out of the way with the elephant in the Richmond Fed computer room. Last week, the Fed payment system went down for about 4 hours, and traders want to know what happened and how vulnerable are we to this happening again?
It was an internal issue. I think we've described that, and it was an operator issue. It got fixed, and it's back up and running.
And is this something that's likely to happen again? There have been calls to let the private sector have an even bigger role in the payment system. Does this undermine the Fed's argument that it should be the main payments master?
Oh, no, I don't think this one's going to happen again. That we've figured out. And, you know, these things do happen. Systems do click up and click down. I think we've addressed this one.
All right, ISM manufacturing, I want to get to that today. The headline, the highest in 3 years. Employment, the highest in 2 years. Prices paid, the highest since 2008 when the PCE index was over 4%. But what struck me among all that were the comments from manufacturers. And you have people saying, like, things are now out of control. Everything is a mess, and we're seeing wide-scale shortages. Labor shortages at suppliers are affecting material delivery and prices. We are so overloaded with orders and do not have the personnel to get product out the door on schedule. Prices are rising so rapidly that many are wondering if the situation is sustainable. Are we overheating in manufacturing? Should we be worried about implications for growth and inflation?
Well, as I've been on the ground in my district talking to manufacturers, you do see this situation. A lot of them closed down for a couple months last year. When we came back, the amount of excess savings in people's pockets led to people rotating towards spending on goods. And so there's been a lot of demand. And frankly, they've been behind the curve trying to catch up. And, you know, when you're in a manufacturing shop, it's not as easy as saying, why don't you just open up another line? That takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of lead time. And so people have been, you know, working at 110%, but demand has just continued to be extremely strong for anything related to time at home, outdoor recreation, those kinds of expenditures. And so, you know, people are I hear the same thing you saw in that survey, which is the manufacturing sector is very busy and working hard to keep up. What that does for prices, I do think we're going to have price pressure in the fall, in the spring, because I do think we're going to have pent-up demand as vaccines are rolled out and warmer weather approaches. So I do think we're going to see that price pressure.
Well, some of your colleagues, including the chair last week, dismissed the bond market moves as basically a sign of confidence in the economy and said that the inflation moves we are expecting will be short-lived. But traders say it's not that simple, that yes, maybe at the longer end you have some of that, but at the shorter end, there's a lack of repo collateral. Overnight Treasury repo trading went negative on an intraday basis a couple times. Do you see anything in the markets that the Fed will have to address?
Well, I focus on some of the fundamentals. And, you know, if you talk about price pressure, as I said, we'll see that in the short term, not least of which because we're rounding over the next few months that were deflationary last year. So the 12-month numbers will look a little higher than normal. But inflation is a longer-term phenomenon. At its core, it relates to expectations and what people expect prices to be. And I have to say, as I'm speaking to businesses in our district, I'm not hearing a sense of overwhelming desire or intent to be escalating prices beyond normal levels. So I think we will see some pressure, but I do still expect the medium and long term for it to be moderated.
Well, I guess the question that arises in connection with that is, what about compensation? Yes, firms say they're raising prices because they're having to pay more for raw materials, but is anybody going to be raising prices in order to raise compensation because they're having trouble attracting employees?
Well, you do have this mismatch in the employee base. You've got a lot of folks out of work, unprecedentedly large number. they tend to be focused in these personal contact service industry jobs, waiters and waitresses, housekeepers, and the like. And then you've got a lot of employers who are short-staffed. They tend to be more in technology and manufacturing and construction. And so you do hear cost pressure, comp pressure in some of those sectors. But by the same token, you obviously don't hear it in those personal contact service sectors. And I think one of the interesting challenges for the next 6 months is going to be how many of those personal contact service jobs come back. For the ones that don't come back, how redeployable, how retrainable those folks are for the jobs that are available. And so we'll have to see how the net of that plays out.
I want to see if you can connect the dots for our viewers and listeners. There is a mismatch that may drive some wages higher. We are seeing some prices higher. You have a relatively strong forecast for the spring and summer. Is the market fixation on inflation inconceivable, or is it misplaced?
Well, like I said, when you think about inflation, you got to think about expectations. And so I watch carefully both survey and market-based sense of inflation expectations. And those metrics are up from where they were 6 months ago, but frankly, still short of where our targets would suggest they should be. And so I haven't yet seen the indicator that expectations are moving out of line with a reasonable range.
I guess the underlying question is, because you're with the Fed, is with the yield curve steepening as it has, and the short end getting very short and the long end rising quite a bit. Folks at Bank of America, for example, your neighborhood bank, say you're losing control of the yield curve at both ends. And I'm wondering if you see that, or if you have any concerns that interest rates will affect decision making out in corporate America.
Well, I think we obviously have control of the yield curve at the short end. And at the longer end, I think when it moves, it depends a lot on the driver. If the driver is normalizing inflation expectations, that's welcome. If the driver would be, which it hasn't been so far, elevated inflation expectations, that would be worrisome. If the driver is, as it seems to be, news about vaccines or news about health of the economy or news about fiscal stimulus, then I think it's a natural reaction. And at these level of interest rates, when I talk to businesses in my district, I do not hear any sense that people are dialing back their investment intent.
There's also concern that there may be some over-levered companies out there. Do you see that in your district?
Well, there's certainly over-levered companies in my district and in every district. I'm not seeing, though, anything that seems like an outsized level of financial distress, at least not at this point.
A question that John Farrow asked me this morning. Are you more concerned about bond market volatility or about the markets pulling forward the date of a Fed rate move?
I'm mostly concerned about the labor market and this mismatch that we've talked about. GDP at the end of the year was 2.5% down. Employment was 6.5% down. And a large part of that reason is these employment intensive industries like restaurants and hotels that aren't yet back to full thing. So I'm trying to focus a lot on the real economy, and the thing I'm most focused on is how are we going to support participation in the workforce? How are we going to support redeployment, the public health challenges we have in terms of getting people back to work? And I think that's the place that our mandate would suggest I should be focusing.
Well, the speed of the recovery is a key component of the market's questions, and there's an argument this isn't going to be like a normal recovery. This is going to be much, much faster. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it already has been fast, at least on the GDP side. If you map this downturn versus other downturns, you'll see a much, much steeper drop, but the slope being much, much steeper on the way up. Again, we'll have to see on the employment side. I do think if we have good news on the public health side in terms of vaccines and cases continuing to come down as we go into the spring, that will be extremely positive for businesses and for workers. And then I think we're going to have to see where the economy settles on the back end of it. How many restaurants haven't made it, for example. And as I said earlier, people being redeployed into those occupations that seem to be hiring.
One of the things I think criticize my own industry is unfair. Both market participants and reporters tend to say, Well, the market is telling us this today, and the Fed is telling us something that they did 3 months ago at the last quarterly forecast that they made. And you can't really compare the two. So I'm going to ask you about March. Do you think your view of the economy, of unemployment, inflation, and where interest rates will be has changed since you last put out a forecast in December?
That's a good question. I don't think my forecast has changed, but I do think the uncertainty range has narrowed. And so if you go back to my last forecast, which was the second week of December, vaccines really hadn't been put out there. So there are questions of how fast could the distribution be? How effective could they be? And whether it's in the US or you look at countries like Israel, it does look like they can be rolled out relatively quickly and they can be relatively effective. So I think that's one big change. A second big change in the forecast is the fiscal stimulus that was passed at the end of the year. When I did my last forecast, that was still uncertain whether it would happen. And the discussions that are happening right now about an additional stimulus. So both of those things, I think, have reduced the downside in the economy quite significantly. I do think, and I was hopeful, I think I'd say on those things, but again, there was a much wider range of uncertainty at that point than I think I see now.
Well, has the elimination of uncertainty changed your view on interest rate policy at all? The markets have brought in a tightening from 2023 to 2022. Would you think that is a fair possibility, or are we talking too far ahead to even know?
I think you're thinking too far ahead. Thank you for giving me that. No, look, we have outcome-based forward guidance. That's true on asset purchases. That's true on rates. I think it's as clear and explicit outcome-based guidance as we've seen. And I think the challenge for me, certainly, and maybe even the challenge for investors, is to not try to turn that into calendar-based guidance, but to say, well, let's see how the outcomes go. And, you know, we could have a great rollout of a very effective vaccine. There's still risks of variants and those kind of things on the other side. This pent-up demand, and the excess savings, which are in people's pockets, could be deployed quicker than I think they would, or maybe they'll be deployed somewhat more slowly. So I think we're just going to have to see how the economy develops. And I hope and think we've given pretty good guideposts in terms of how we'd react under different scenarios.
Well, one last quick question, because you mentioned asset prices. Are you concerned about asset prices at this point?
Asset prices on their own? Well, I think there's a lot that is rational. For example, on the housing side, supply has been constrained for many years. Demand was limited until just recently, but millennials are buying houses, and people who have been stuck at home have seen the flaws in their own houses and have decided to try to upgrade in a world where there's limited supply. So I'm not surprised to see housing prices go up. I let each asset class settle in its own place. And I'm trying to focus on unemployment and inflation.
Tom Barkin, thank you very much for joining us today here on Bloomberg Radio and Television, president of the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank. Good to see you. Thanks for being with us. Send it back to you.
And thank you so very much to our very own Michael McKean talking with Tom Barkin of the Richmond Fed. Coming up, what we learned about the future of the Republican Party from the Conservative Political Action Conference over the weekend. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Today, a Bloomberg exclusive conversation. J.P. Morgan Chase Chairman and CEO Jamie Dimon. Live at 1:30 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Johnson & Johnson is looking for ways to get its COVID-19 vaccine administered as fast as possible. The company's looking for manufacturing partnerships to increase supply of its vaccine that was cleared Saturday by federal regulators. J&J says it will deliver 3.9 million doses of its one-shot vaccine within the next 24 to 48 hours. The company wants to speed up its timeline of supplying enough vaccines to immunize 20 million Americans by the end of the month and 100 million by the end of June. Immigration will be the main topic when President Biden holds a virtual meeting with Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador today. The Mexican leader plans to propose a labor program that could bring up to 800,000 immigrants a year to work legally in the United States. A senior Biden administration official wouldn't say whether the president supports that proposal. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to decide whether it is unconstitutional to exclude people living in Puerto Rico from supplemental Social Security income. The justices say they would hear the appeal that was first filed by the Trump administration. It disputed a lower court ruling that held that residents of the U.S. territory should have the same access to SSI benefits as older disabled and blind Americans in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Donald Trump told a group of conservatives he's laying the groundwork for a third presidential campaign. The former president stopped short of declaring that he's a candidate for the 2024 race. Still, in his 90-minute speech in Orlando, Mr. Trump made it clear he thinks he's the best choice for the Republican nomination. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, as Mark just reported, we had that CPAC gathering over the weekend, and President Trump did appear, didn't say he's going anywhere anytime soon, but didn't quite say he's running for president either. At the same time, Republicans, if you listen to, have very different views about exactly what the former president's role should be in the Republican Party going forward.
The Trump movement is alive and well. People believe that he brought change to Washington. Policy-wise, it was long overdue. All I can say is that the most potent force in the Republican Party is President Trump.
We've got to win in 2 years. We've got to win in 4 years. If we do that, we'll do that by speaking to those issues that are important to the American people. And there's a lot of issues important to them right now, not by putting one person on a pedestal and making that one person our focal point. If we idolize one person, we will lose. And that's kind of clear from the last election.
To give us her perspective on exactly what's going on in the Republican Party, welcome now Jan Brewer. She is, of course, the former Republican governor of the state of Arizona. So, Governor, thank you so much for being with us. Let's pick up with what Senator Cassidy said there. I suspect you agree you want to win 2 years from now, 4 years from now. Is that better with Donald Trump at the head of the party or without him?
Oh, I think that that indeed is our goal, that we're going to, win the next general election in 2022 and then move forward to 2024. But I think that overwhelmingly people really support Donald Trump. I think he is the leader of our party at this point in time, and that he will hold that moving forward. I know that everybody in the Republican Party, I believe, majority of people really, really appreciate his policies and the things that he has done, and they like his style, given the fact that he just doesn't talk. He actually makes his policies happen, and we haven't seen much of that in the past. So I think that with his direction and moving forward in the Republican Party, now that we know that it's been settled, he's sticking with us as a Republican, and that we are the party of the big tent. We have always been the party of the big tent. We've always had controversies. And, we didn't always agree, but if we agree, 70, 80% of the time, we can get the job done. I think that's where we're headed.
So, Governor, you made a very important point there, because President Trump, some people thought, might try to start his own party. And he came out and said, I'm not doing that. We just split the party. That would mean we would lose. We don't want to do that. At the same time, as you said, he has a lot of support, clearly overwhelming support from that gathering in Orlando. But support's one thing. Saying you want him to be the candidate for president next time is another, because the poll that was done showed something like 97% support for President Donald Trump in general, but only 55% said that they would prefer him to be the candidate. Do you have a sense that there are people who really like his policies, like a lot of what he's done, but would just as soon not have him be the presidential candidate?
I think there's a certain population out there that indeed love his policies, and they love the direction that he has taken our country, but I think they would like the message delivered a little bit differently, and I think that gives them, a little bit of heartburn. And so I believe that they probably want somebody that they would perceive as not being divisive, because, of course, that population, that group of people, they feel that he's divisive. It's his way or the highway sometimes. But that's what our primaries are all about. We fight it out in the primaries. and then we get behind our candidates in the general election. So it'll be interesting to see just exactly how much sway that Donald Trump has in the 2022 election, and how we all come together and how we discuss this.
Yeah, as you say.
Fun.
Sorry.
It's going to be fun.
Oh, fun. Yeah, of course. As you say, you get behind your candidate, and Mitch McConnell, the minority leader now in the Senate, has said that if he's the nominee, he will back President Trump without a doubt. At the same time, if it's not Donald Trump, who is it? I mean, for example, let's talk about some governors. I mean, you were a governor. Some people think it's good to have a governor in that role because they've run something, they've run a state. For example, people talk about Ron DeSantis from Florida.
Right. Well, obviously, he did very, very well in the straw poll there at CPAC. Unbelievably great. And of course, we believe in freedom, and he has exhibited that. Then there's that portion of our party that believe that maybe it should have been a little bit more under control. So those are things that are going to have to be worked out. But now with the vaccine, I think we're going to see everything kind of getting back to normal, kids going back to school, businesses regaining their place in our society and becoming more social, and jobs, back to people so that they can live a life. And I think that the story moving forward is going to be much different than what we're actually living today. But there's a lot of good candidates out there that want to give it a try, and we'll just have to wait and see. A lot can change in 2 years.
Oh, that's for sure. It's a lifetime and more in politics. You know better than I. At the same time, a lot of potential candidates out there, but did the Donald Trump you saw over the weekend really allow them any room to try to grow up? I mean, as a practical matter, if I were a candidate, might be a little bit scared.
Well, I think they should be a little bit aware of the fact that he wants to be either possibly the kingmaker or the king himself, and I mean that in a nice way. But if you're a politician, you're faced with those kinds of things lots of times. As a freshman kind of elected official myself, I ran against two incumbents, both for the House and the Senate and the Board of Supervisors when I first started out because they weren't doing their job. Right. That's what primaries are about.
Yeah. Thank you so much to former Arizona Governor Jan Brewer. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Coming up in the second hour of Balance of Power, we have a very special exclusive interview. It was with Jamie Dimon. He's the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan Chase. That's on Bloomberg Television and Radio. It's coming up 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Radio.